for ECN 211 for ASU's Earned Admissions Program. This office hour will cover a few current events. I hope that what I hope to do in the next hour is go over a few news items and give you some sense of how the current news is related to the things that you've learned over the last 4 weeks in the final part of this class, and then of course also in the first 3 weeks when you were learning about households and businesses and how you can think about equilibrium in the macroeconomy. Then at the end of this office hour, we will discuss a little bit about how I think you can prepare for the final. And I'll remind you of the same material that I reminded you for in the previous office hour, which is some of the review material that is available for part 7. So in this case, it's available. Last time we just went over it in the office hour. So definitely do that. Go over the review material, and I'll cover some of it as well. And then I'll wrap things up, and hopefully you'll wrap things up successfully in the coming week when you complete your final. So let's get started. There's a few things I want to discuss today. One is I want to talk a little bit about the deficits, the federal government's deficits. The House, well, basically the legislative branch, including the Democrats in the House, but implicitly also the Republicans in the Senate, have come to an agreement with the executive branch, most notably the director of the OMB as well as the Treasury Secretary, on a budget proposal, and with that comes also raising the debt ceiling for the federal government. And I want to talk a little bit about this is one of the few things actually both parties in Congress seem to agree on, although a lot of economists agree on that this might not be so sustainable. So let's look at the deficit outlook for the US a little, and the projections for the debt to GDP ratio in the context of the material that you've learned in part 5. So we'll do that. That's kind of based on the current news. Then Adam asked the question. There's a video in the current course in which Fernanda Necchio discusses hyperinflation in Brazil and her experiences with hyperinflation in Brazil. Now, it's really useful to hear someone talk about their own experience with hyperinflation. And Adam asked the question, are there other more recent episodes beyond Brazil where hyperinflation has occurred? So I wanted to show you some of the most recent data from Venezuela. My apologies. Next thing, I'm going to talk a little bit. You just asked a little bit about the ARA, basically the Fiscal Stimulus Act that was passed during the last recession. And so I'll talk a little bit about fiscal stimulus as well, actually, in the context of the deficits, but largely also about what's going on now with fiscal stimulus. Again, related to part 5, and then Adam's question about Venezuela is about part 6. I do want you to be aware that there's a big decision being made this week, namely about interest rates, so related to part 7. Follow the news and follow what the Federal Reserve decides. So I'll show you the FOMC calendar webpage where you could find the FOMC's decision later on this week on Wednesday when they announce what they're going to do with interest rates. So I'll show you a link, and so you get some sense of what you're reading in the news later on this week. Then we'll talk about exchange rates. These are always a little confusing, and I'll go over a few exercises kind of on the definition of exchange rates to help you out. That's from part 7.141. There were also a couple of discussion questions about that. And then I will we'll discuss some of the effects of tariffs on inflation, and I'll show you some of my own research on this. So put kind of the current discussion of tariffs and trade and the consequences of tariffs on inflation and other macro variables that you've just seen and learned about in that context. So I'll do that, and I'll give you a little read of some of the stuff that I've done on that. And then that's it. We'll do final exam prep, and then a final thank you note. So in order to do that, let me share my browser with you. So and in particular, let me just emphasize that this is part of the major of the ECN 211 course here at the ASU. So I'm going to focus on a few discussion questions that have been posted. And the first one was actually by UGIS, and it was about what was the effect of the ARRA, which was a big fiscal stimulus that was passed during the Great Recession. Now, to understand the ARRA and the consequences of policymakers' decisions, remember that what happens in recessions often is that the government runs bigger deficits than normal. Now, this and that will show up in this figure, because this figure actually plots the federal debt held by the public as a percentage of gross domestic product. This is from a publication on the long-term fiscal outlook that gets published every year by the Congressional Budget Office. So what you can see here is that the debt to GDP ratio in the US generally was below 40% effectively. And there was one spike in it when the US ran up a lot of debt. When the US ran up a lot of debt because of the Second World War and the costs of being in the war. Now, what's really happened since basically the end of the 1970s is that the government has been running persistent deficits, and the debt to GDP ratio has been running up over time. It came down a little here in the middle of the 1990s, this part, but there was a very specific period that was the period in which people, the baby boomers, started working and paying into the Social Security system. So this is actually a little bit different probably than what you would think about the federal deficit. This has nothing to do with income taxes, it has to do with payroll taxes. People were paying more into the Social Security system and the Medicare system than those systems were paying out. So and that looked like they were running a surplus, and of course they were supposed to put this money aside for the future. They didn't. They lent it to the rest of the government. But that's so I would take that with a little bit with a grain of salt. And then in the early 2000s, deficits started going up again. There were tax cuts, and there was obviously a 2001 recession. And then in 2008, in response to the 2008 recession, the debt to GDP ratio ran up significantly. There's a question in the course material about this as well. Partly this had to do with bank bailouts, but in the end, the bank bailouts by the federal government were actually not that costly. The federal government made a lot of that money back. What was most costly to some extent was that the government decided to run a very substantial deficit on top of the bank bailouts to stimulate the economy. Now, that was very similar to what had been done under Roosevelt in the New Deal. So think about the Great Depression. You know, there was also a substantial deficit. What happens in a recession is taxes go down and then expenditures go up to stimulate the economy. So to some extent, this idea of doing stimulus in a deep recession is very much in line with the Keynesian policies implemented in the Great Depression. And that made the debt to GDP ratio go up substantially. Now, you also have to realize that, for example, they extended the Bush tax cuts. There were other things that have been in place. All of these lower tax revenue. Then on top of that, they increased spending. What is remarkable here is that's not abnormal to have the debt to GDP ratio go up in recession. It happened in the Great Depression, and to some extent, some of the run up here at the end of the 70s also had to do with ideas of fiscal stimulus. Of course, then afterwards, the U.S. kept on running deficits in the 80s and early 90s, partly due to tax cuts and partly also due to defense spending and the Cold War. Now, what's really different in the projections now is that we're seeing the debt to GDP ratio being projected to grow pretty dramatically to 150 to 160% in 2050. And this is largely due to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Now, on top of that, Congress is passing every year through the appropriations bills additional deficits run on the other parts of spending by the federal government, what we call the discretionary spending. And so this projection actually would probably be low now because it predates what was passed last week or was agreed on, it hasn't passed yet, last week in terms of the budget decisions. So again, the projected debt to GDP ratio for the US is going up a lot. Now, and largely, this is not tax cuts, and largely they do contribute. And largely, this is not the actual spending on, say, defense or on the Department of Education, or no, this is largely just Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And in fact, at the end of this horizon, so we're talking about the end of the 2040s here, at that point, under current policies, all tax revenue would be going towards Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, as well as paying off the interest on the debt. So everything else, no matter whether you talk about defense, Department of Agriculture, national parks, whatever is your favorite particular spending beyond Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, would be deficit spending under current projections. So this is the long-run outlook for the U.S. For U.S. debt and the federal government. Now, what is remarkable about the current situation, this is from the Committee for the Responsible Federal Budget, so you could go to cfrb.org and download this plot, is we are in an economy where we are normally, what we're seeing, we're in an economy where the federal government is running remarkably big deficits, like 5% of GDP, or here it said 4.6% of GDP. And so it's running big deficits. And it depends even on what you assume going forward, how large these deficits are, whether you assume certain tax cuts will expire and some other things that are happening going forward. But these deficits are large, 5% of GDP or higher. And the point of this chart is that the only times that was done in the past was in times like here, in the Great Recession, here, where the government was running large deficits, partly because of stabilization of the economy as a stabilization tool. But we don't need stabilization to some extent because the economy is actually doing relatively well and the unemployment rate is relatively low and GDP growth is hovering around 3% a year. We're definitely not in a recession. So what is interesting at this point for U.S. fiscal policy is actually that we have a very stimulative fiscal policy, even though the economy itself is not necessarily in a state where it needs that much stimulus. It's actually relatively robustly chugging along at around 3% a year in terms of GDP growth. So that makes this period rather exceptional and makes the size of the current deficits as a fraction of GDP rather large for the current state of the business cycle. Now, I'm withholding my judgment on whether this is good or bad. I'll leave that to other people to decide, and most importantly, you. Do you think the government should run such big deficits? And if they run such big deficits, you can also ask, why are they running it? What are they doing with the money they're borrowing? Are they investing it in infrastructure? Are they paying it out in entitlements? Are they running a deficit because they gave tax cuts to people who deserve those tax cuts, or maybe to people who don't deserve it? These are things that I don't necessarily want to tell you what to think about, but these are things you should think about now that you know more about how to think about the overall structure of the economy. So that's about the deficit. The next topic I wanted to cover was hyperinflation. And I'm very glad that Fernanda Necchio took the time a while ago to make this video and talked about her own experiences with hyperinflation. Let me close this for a second. So the next, Fernanda Necchio, I took the time to talk about hyperinflation, and I'm really grateful she did that, because you don't hear in the US, obviously very few people have lived through hyperinflation. I knew some people in the Netherlands who grew up in the Weimar Republic, in Germany, who lived through hyperinflation. They would tell you different but kind of similar in tone anecdotes as what you heard from Fernando in the video. Now, Adam asked, can we talk a little bit about other examples of hyperinflation? And I think that's nice. I think it's also nice to kind of think about what's going on right now in the world. And so one country that has had hyperinflation currently is Venezuela. And largely this is because Venezuela's government had lost a large sources of its revenue. First of all, because it's largely been cut out of the international oil market, so it doesn't get revenues from oil sales. On top of that, the Venezuelan economy has now been so disorganized that it's actually really hard for them to actually run an IRS and get income taxes from people. Of course, the government keeps on spending, even though it gets a shortfall in revenue. The result then is that the government would run big deficits. And so many governments that run a shortfall in revenue that want to continue to spend or need to continue to spend have only one way. If they can't borrow the money from abroad, then they have only one thing that they can do, which is print money and use that money to finance government spending. Now, the printing of money, the value of the printed money, is called seigniorage revenue. Now, in the US, we barely talk about it. It shows up in the GDP accounts. You can look it up as the profits of the Federal Reserve. They get remitted to the Treasury. Nobody even talks about it because, in principle, the Federal Reserve should be independent of the government, and it should not operate under a profit motive. It should operate under the motive with its monetary policy to maximize employment and have stable prices. Now, if you throw those things out of the window and say, well, you know what, we're going to use the central bank to print money in order to finance government spending, and what you're really doing is you're printing a lot of money, and once there's a lot of money around, the value of that money will go down. And of course, inflation measures the decline in the value of money. So this is exactly what happened in Venezuela when basically the economy collapsed. The Venezuelan economy, by the way, the collapse of the Venezuelan economy is remarkable. It is the fastest collapse of any economy in the world that we have measured since we keep national income and product accounts data across countries, of any economy in the world that has not been at war, so during peacetime. It is just a stunning development. So let's talk a little bit about hyperinflation in Venezuela and kind of look at the numbers. The reason I'm doing that with you is two reasons. One is so you see the numbers for Venezuela. The other is that it also points you to a very useful data source, namely the IMF data mapper, in which you can download international data. So a lot of US data is linked in the course, and you could look at it, and the sources are very well documented. But sometimes you read about international data, and so there's a couple of quick data sources that are worthwhile. The one that I tend to look at the most is the IMF data mapper, since it's also easy to see the data on the internet. So here's a Bolivar. This is the actual Venezuelan currency, and it looks like this is actually 500 Bolivar, but there's a little word underneath it. My Spanish is not very good enough. Quinientos. Anyway, it's actually 500 million Bolivar. And the way to see that on this is there anywhere else to see this? No. So, but this is a 500 million Bolivar note. And the reason that it's with so many zeros is because Bolivars are not worth a lot of money. In fact, there's been newspaper articles about people making wallpaper out of it on their bathroom walls. So the point is that Venezuela's currency has gone down in value simply because of hyperinflation. And it's actually worthwhile to see how that's reflected. So here's the IMF data map. You can just Google IMF data map. You get this page, basically. I'm looking at data specifically from what's known as the World Economic Outlook. That's basically the outlook that the IMF has prepared for what is going on in the world economy. And this one is the outlook from April 2019. here on the right, you could go and see the data for every country. In particular, what we're looking at here is we're looking at the inflation rate for each of the countries and the average of the consumer prices over a year, the percentage change in the average consumer price between one year and another. Venezuela's here, 10 million. To give you some sense of how large that is, here's the United States. Our inflation rate is about 2%. In many industrialized countries, it's about 2%. And the best estimate of the IMF, when you average across the world, is inflation is around 3.6% across countries. In Venezuela, inflation is 10 million %. This amounts to prices, if I'm not mistaken, prices doubling about every 4 days. Here's the IMF's data on inflation in Venezuela. As you can see, inflation in Venezuela was relatively low, but this plot, of course, is plotted from 0 to 10 million. So the hyperinflation in Venezuela really took off very much in 2017, 18, and 19. Let's see what I can zoom in for you into a previous period. So in 2011, inflation in Venezuela was 27%. So it was still relatively high, but not as high. In 1995, inflation in Venezuela was actually, so Venezuela has always had high inflation, but of course, it's really skyrocketed in recent years. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you here is that the IMF actually publishes its forecast. That's really cool if you want to have the forecast for different countries in the world. If you have a job and you need to know what we're thinking about what the economy in Thailand is going to do, you could look at the IMF webpage. But here's the IMF's forecast for inflation in Venezuela. They assume that it's going to be 10 million percentage points, a year going forward all the way through 2024. Now, I think my interpretation of this is that they basically don't know what's going to happen in Venezuela, so they're just assuming the situation will remain the same. It's not very common that this type of hyperinflationary episode would actually go on for 6 or 7 years in a country. Generally, the damage of it is so high that ultimately there's going to be a reform where the central banks are formed, or what commonly happens is that countries decide to dollarize, because once a country is dollarized, in order to keep the exchange rate fixed relative to the dollar, the central bank basically has to follow the Federal Reserve and set the same interest rate. What that does is it takes away the whole monetary policy and money supply decision from the central bank and kind of prevents it from being politicized. And that's, of course, if you credibly dollarize and credibly peg the currency relative to a dollar. So that's what's going on in Venezuela as we speak. And as you see, if you ask me what's going to happen in Venezuela, my answer would be, well, according to the IMF, we're not quite sure. It looks like they're just forecasting things to remain the same, but that's probably because that's their best guess at the moment. So that's on hyperinflation. I hope that kind of helped, and I hope that you understand what generates hyperinflation. And again, this type of, I mean, when we talked about Brazil, we were talking, if I remember correctly, about a 9,000% inflation rate a year. So Venezuela is just way, way worse than that. And basically what that means is people really don't want to hold on to money. They get bolivars and they want to get rid of them as soon as they can, because bolivars, one of the purposes of money is storage of value, but there is no storage of value. The value of bolivars declines so quickly that money doesn't serve that purpose in Venezuela. So that's on hyperinflation. The next thing I wanted to touch on was on chapter, or on part 6, where we talked about monetary policy. Money and monetary policy. Sorry, part 6 too, when we touched on monetary policy. And what I particularly wanted to do is just give you a heads up. And in particular, the Federal Reserve is meeting this week. And there's been a big discussion on whether they're keeping the interest rate fixed or maybe even lowering it. It depends a little on whose speeches you've listened to. Different members of the FOMC, different Federal Reserve Bank presidents have given speeches and sent different signals. So there doesn't seem to be a uniform agreement yet on what they want to do with interest rates. So what I'd like you to do, just as an assignment, not for a grade, but I think you'll learn a lot from it, is once this decision is being made, go to the Federal Reserve website. The decision will be made on the East Coast time on Wednesday at around 11 a.m., give or take. And I'll show you the web page. Let's go back to Venezuela for 1 second, but I'll show you. The web page is this web page at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. If you just Google FOMC calendar or Federal Open Market Committee calendar, then you will basically find this on this web page. Let me show you what's on this web page so that you have some sense. So the Federal Reserve meets every year for 8 times. So this table, this top table, this is basically all the meetings for 2019 all the way till the end. Now, because of some of the meetings in the year haven't happened yet, this is tomorrow's or this week's meeting, and then obviously we haven't been in September, October, or December yet. They've not been filled in, but once they meet, they do the following. They post a video of the press conference that the chair gives. The most important thing and the most highly anticipated thing is actually the statement by the committee. You can click here for PDF, or you can click the HTML version, where they explain what the vote was and whether interest rates are going up or down or staying the same. So this is the statement. It's a short statement, a couple of 3 paragraphs generally. First about the economy, the outlook for GDP, inflation, employment, and then what they think. They first do GDP and employment, then they do inflation, then they interpret how that's going to affect the interest rates in their interpretation, and then there's some overview of what they think about going forward. So it's sometimes known as their forward guidance. So that's the main thing that they issue. This is the statement. Then you can watch the chair of the committee, Jerome Powell, give a press conference. And then a few weeks later, so this was the meeting at the end of April, and then at the end of May, they release a short summary of the discussion at the meeting, known as the minutes. Now, if you want to have the full explanation and all the material that have been prepared for the meetings, you can get them, but this is only obtainable for meetings that are longer than 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago. And so those are the historical materials, so you could get anything that they prepared. What I do in another class, and if you are excited about monetary policy, is download the actual materials for October 2008, which is in the middle of the financial crisis, and see what the Federal Reserve economists and policymakers were thinking about what was going to happen going forward. I think it's a really fun document to read. I mean, and it's very interesting to learn economics through that way, because you basically are going to read what people thought about the economy, how it was developing in the middle of the financial crisis. So I strongly encourage you to read the old transcript and the old Teal book for that historical episode. But of course, if you want to follow this in real time, if you're going to work in financial markets, following the FOMC statement and figuring out where it is useful. So it is at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors website under FOMC meeting calendars, and it will give you this whole list of meetings and all the materials that come with it. Every 2 meetings, they also provide you with projection materials in which each of the members of the committee, anonymously in a pool, reports what their forecast is of what's going to go and happen in the economy in the short, medium, and longer run. Something to watch for on Wednesday. It's summer. There's not a lot of sports on television. There's not a lot of good television series on. And so if you're if you're done binge watching stuff and streaming stuff, this might be something else that's worthwhile doing to supplement this principles course. Now, the FOMC meeting, together with the labor market report, are probably the most highly anticipated things in financial markets in terms of economic news. The labor market report, as we discussed earlier in the course, in part 4, this comes out on the first Friday of the month and contains the unemployment rate as well as payroll employment. So, something to think about, to look forward to the FOMC decision and see what's going to happen. Then the next thing I want to do is go over a couple of things in the last part, in part 7.1 of the course. I know part 7.1 is a lot. There's just a lot to say about trade. I hope you enjoy going through the course material, and we've made it as interactive as we can for you. There's a couple of things that show up there. The most importantly is what's always confusing is the definition of an exchange rate. So I wanted to talk about a particular test your knowledge problem. Sorry. About a particular test your knowledge problem that had come up about how can we think about the value of a currency. And it's really about what you put in the numerator and the denominator. So let's talk through that. Then subsequently, I'll also have show you some data that I dug up with Fernanda Neckhill and Galina Hale and Doris Wilson at the San Francisco Fed that we calculated on, how can you think about how important trade is for the stuff you buy? What part of the stuff you buy is actually, what part of the cost of the stuff you buy actually involves traded goods and services? And then we'll move on to the final exam prep after that. So let's go to the exchange rates first. Let me again share the screen with you. I wanted to talk through, so this is actually the parts 7142, not 7141, 7142, about the definition of exchange rates. And I wanted to show you, just to go over a simple question here that we also had some questions about on the discussion board. So in particular, let's focus on this test your knowledge question 1 here. So we look at these, in the learning object, we defined exchange rates between currencies of different countries. Okay, we got that out of the way, we did that. So then, which of the following exchange rates shows the dollar as the most valuable currency in terms of pesos? What does that mean? Most valuable currency in terms of pesos? That means the most pesos per dollar, right? Now this is going to take forever, but that's what we're going to look at. We'll look at which exchange rate gives us the most pesos per dollar. So let's figure that out. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to actually figure out for each of those. So this is pesos per dollar. This exchange rate says you get 2 pesos per dollar. So in terms of pesos per dollar, you move that down a little. This is directly translatable into 2 pesos per dollar. Okay, we all agree on that one, I hope. That's pretty clear. So if I get 0.2 dollars per peso, then what do I get? Pesos per dollar. I I reverse, or I take the reciprocal of the both sides of this equation. So then I'm going to find 1 over 0.2 is 5 pesos per dollar. Yeah? Are you following me on this one? Then the next one, pesos per dollar is 0.2. This is pesos per dollar, 0.2. And then dollars per pesos is 2. If I pay $2 a peso, then pesos per dollar one over 2 is 0.5. Now, which of these answers then has the highest number of pesos that you get per dollar? And the answer, of course, is answer B. What did I do, and why is this so important for exchange rates? Exchange rates are confusing because there's two ways to define it. I can either look at the dollar-peso exchange rate, about how many pesos I get per dollar, or I could look at how many dollars I get per peso. And depending on whether you're in Mexico or in the US, you want to define it one way or the other. If you're in Mexico, you tend to define how many dollars you get per peso. And if you're in the US, you tend to define it as how many pesos you get per dollar. But clearly, sorry, it's actually the other way around, because the price is how many dollars you pay. So if you're in the US, you're going to figure out how many dollars you pay per peso. And in and in Mexico, you can figure out how many pesos you pay per dollar. And here's where this gets confusing. So the other thing that's important here is that when we talk about an appreciation of the currency or depreciation of the currency, that doesn't necessarily mean that the exchange rate goes up in an appreciation and goes down in a depreciation. That depends on how you define the exchange rate. So we try to do it as consistently as we can in this class, but be aware of that, because that tends to be very confusing. So if I have to pay more dollars per peso, is that an appreciation of the dollar or depreciation of the dollar? Well, it means the dollar, if I have to pay more dollars to get a peso, then the dollar becomes less valuable relative to the peso. So it's a depreciation of the dollar. So there's other parts of the exchange rates. Of course, as you know from the course material, a large part of the discussion is about a strong dollar appreciating. It's not necessarily good for everyone in the US. And so this obviously is something I really want you to take away from this course material, and I hope you do. But again, that all involves thinking through these exchange rates and how they work and who they affect. And so the first thing then to understand is how these exchange rates are defined. So that's why I wanted to go over this with you. So that's as far as I wanted to discuss exchange rates with you. I do want to emphasize that thinking through exchange rates and thinking through who benefits from an appreciation or depreciation is extremely important. And that's why we spend so much time of the course material on this, because one of the common mistakes economic students make, even after taking a principles class like this, is to think that the strong dollar is good, because strong has a very positive connotation. So if something is strong, it must be good. But actually, a strong dollar is only good if you buy a whole bunch of imported stuff, because that gets cheap. If you export stuff, a strong dollar will hurt you. A strong dollar is good if you go abroad and you go on vacation, you travel, it makes foreign things cheaper. But a strong dollar is bad if you are at Disneyland, California, and you get more expensive. It gets more expensive for foreigners to visit. So it all depends on, it's all relative on how you look at it. And so who benefits from a strong currency and who suffers under a strong currency is one of the main topics here, and the answer to this is clearly some people suffer and some people benefit. Now, that's even true for trade in general, of course. Overall, we think trade is beneficial for everyone, and you saw this in the diagrams that we did with Adam and Janet. But that's a kind of a very literally pie in the sky, because it is about pies, example. But in the real world, some people lose their jobs because they get competed away by, if you used to make white T-shirts somewhere in South Carolina in a textile mill, now your job gets offshore to a textile factory in Vietnam. You suffer from it. Other people benefit because they can buy cheap T-shirts now, and the price will go down by several dollars. But of course, the people who make these goods that are now not being made in the US will suffer. Now, largely, a lot of these jobs that get dissolved due to trade get replaced with other jobs. I always tell people to think of dog walkers and yoga teachers, but that takes a generation. So if you've been schooled to work in a textile mill, it's not going to be so easy to become a yoga teacher. So, so it takes a while, and so the cost of trade and the cost of the impact of trade tends to be borne by a particular generation of workers whose skills depreciate quickly. It's not only true with trade, of course. Technological progress does something very similar, and you're part of the technology frontier on teaching. And the fact that I can teach you hundreds of euro video class on a video also means that this technology is a threat to in-class own classes and teachers. Okay. So that was on exchange rates. One of the things, of course, that's been going on in the economy is that this administration has imposed tariffs. And so because we're talking about trade and the impact of trade on people's lives, I wanted to give you some data on how important trade is in terms of the goods that you buy as a consumer. So I'm going to talk about personal consumption expenditures, like what do consumers and households buy, and how much of that is actually traded goods and traded services. And it turns out mostly these are traded goods. The US imports a lot of goods, not a lot of services that consumers buy. Now, foreigners actually buy a lot of services that the US makes. So think about movies and entertainment, the royalties that come with it. Think about education. If you're a foreign student taking this class, we are exporting a service as ASU to you. So, but the US mainly imports goods. So let's look at some data on that. Again, I'll share my screen with you. In particular, I wanted to show you something that I did for something with people at the San Francisco Fed. I've done calculations like this often on other publications. This is with Galina, Fernanda, and Doris, sorry. And Fernanda, you've seen in the video on hyperinflation. Now, what we did was we asked ourselves, if you buy stuff that says made in the USA, or if you buy stuff that's made in China, how much of this actually is coming from the US? And this turns out to be, it's a calculation. If you think about it, it's pretty clear. If you make a white t-shirt, if you buy a white tee at Walmart, then often these days it doesn't say made in China on it, it says made in Vietnam on it, but it says made in China on it. Not all the money goes to China. There's some evidence, for example, Nike sneakers that we also discussed in the course. If you buy a $100 pair of Nike sneakers that says made in Asia, say made in China or Vietnam or Malaysia, the actual amount that Nike actually pays for the manufacturing of the sneaker to Asian manufacturers is $25, a quarter of the price. Then there's some shipping costs that's really not big, because these shoes just get loaded on a container and it gets shipped to the US. It's not very costly. Then about 21% of this goes to Nike to cover design, marketing, and then of course also Nike's paying its shareholders. It makes profits, so part of this is going to the profits of Nike. And then $50 out of this, half of the price, actually goes to things in the US, to the US retailer. Of course, the workers in the store get paid, the store gets rented, so there's rental for the retail space, there's insurance the store needs to buy, there's other things, electricity, things that the store needs to buy. So when you buy something that says made in China, very often a much smaller, there's not a high fraction of the cost of that actually goes to China. And if you do this for all spending in the US, you're going to find something pretty surprising. First of all, let me show you that this is the diagram I wanted to show you. If you look at the ones that say made in China, they're generally cheaper things that then get paid, that get sold at a higher markup. And so 55% actually stays in the US. Now, for goods that are imported from the euro area, this is largely cars. And cars, of course, the cost of a car is that for a dealer is a large part of the final sticker price, that a dealer charges for a car. So because largely this is reflecting cars, for the euro area, this is much lower. But even if you buy something that is made in Mexico or made in Japan, about 40% of this stuff, the 40% of what you spend on it, actually goes directly to US transporters, retailers, and other workers, and goes directly to people in the US. So don't think necessarily that when you buy something that says made in Mexico or made in China, all the money goes to Mexico or China. Here, this chart shows you how much is actually imported of what we spend. And so this classifies spending in the economy. So let's look at the unadjusted numbers. In terms of services, in terms of non-durable goods, so this is like peanut butter and clothing, and then durable goods are furniture, computers, electronics, and cars. So as you can see, of the total, if we trace back what fraction of spending is actually due to imports, so we don't mean that you spend it on something that says made in China. We're also going correct for what fraction actually is the cost of the trade. And you see, most services you buy, very few things are imported. There's very few imported services into the United States, and largely what's reflected here that's imported services are actually when you go on vacation to Italy, that's considered an import of services from Italy to the US, even though you're consuming it in Italy because you're a US consumer. If you're American, it would be an import of tourist services into the US. And then what's the biggest thing in the US and for consumption expenditures is non-durable goods, so largely textiles and some types of kind of it's mainly actually textiles and apparel, and then there's furniture and cars that make up their parts on the durables. Now, the main point I wanted to make here is that we talk a lot about trade, but actually the cost of traded goods don't make up such a huge fraction, only about 2.5% of what you actually spend. So most of the stuff you spend would be on rent, or rent would be in services. You're buying a service, or on your mortgage, which we also would include in services, or your electricity bill, things like that, on healthcare. All of these are in services, and all of these are primarily produced in the United States. So the US is actually not a super open economy. We talk about globalization a lot, but most of the stuff we buy here in the United States is made in the United States. So that's actually something to be aware of. There's other countries that are much more open. They're generally smaller countries that are rich. You can think of the UK as a much more open economy, for example. So for Brexit, trade and Brexit is more important in the UK because the UK is a more open economy than the United States. So that was kind of to put the discussion on inflation. And what I tell people, students, and even when I give speeches to non-students, what I tend to tell people is that, yeah, we talk a lot about trade in the United States, and trade's important, globalization is important. But at the end, the US is a relatively closed economy. We make most of the stuff we consume ourselves. Now, for the stuff that businesses buy, which are capital goods, there's a higher fraction of import content. They rely on machines, they rely on robots, they rely on computers. And those types of goods tend to be produced abroad more than in the United States. So there, it's more important. So I hope that these discussions of current policy issues and some of the additional data help to put the stuff that you've been learning in perspective and help you kind of put the material here in this principles class in the context of what's going on and what's being discussed now. Now, of course, that's wonderful, and it helps you because it gives you a little bit of a grasp of why this is real-world relevant in terms of the material. But of course, what's most relevant is actually your final exam. So the final thing I want to do in this office hours, discuss a little bit of final exam prep, and let me do that by going back to the course material. What we have included in the course material is section 7221. And what we've done is we've recorded some videos. I deliberately didn't record them myself. I had Jared Gruff, who's a fantastic guy who has his degree from ASU, both in economics and as well as in education. So he's actually been a high school economics teacher. Give you some overview of kind of what he thinks you should learn in terms of the course material. I really strongly recommend you. I know the final is coming up soon. It's opening soon, next tomorrow. So is to go over these parts. So we have a part on key concepts. We have a part on exam strategy. And we also have a glossary of all the terms that are covered in the course. So this is a total overview of all the terms covered. So hopefully that helps you. I strongly recommend you. I went over the exam strategy part informally last time, and now that it's available, definitely make sure that you go over the exam strategy part. Understand, sit down once you do the final with a purpose. Of course, you want to make sure if the proctoring all works and the technology is all set up. But then, once you sit down and you start, you really want to understand, how am I going to approach this exam? What am I going to do? I'm going to go over the questions, figure out which ones are the easiest, do them first, then I'll do the medium hard ones, and then I'll do the hard ones. You want to understand what you understand. You want to understand what you don't understand. And you want to understand what you kind of do. And do the stuff that you know first. That's the most important thing I can say. And again, I did that in the last office hour. I do that again. I teach this every time, at every level, no matter what it's undergraduate students like you, MBA students, PhD students, or master's students. I say this every time I teach. And I can see you do your exam. I've seen a few videos of students doing exam, but that's for auditing purposes. But when I give an in-class exam, even though I say this, more than half of the students don't do this. They just start at the beginning and then go from the beginning to the end. Don't do that. Focus on what's your best at first. So go through this. Do we put this in the course for a reason? You might think, oh, it's not part of the real exam material. We spent time putting this in the course because we really thought going through this, and it doesn't take that much time, will help you improve your exam score. So I wanted to wish you all the best on the final, yeah, hope that you all do well on it. I know this is a very dense course in 7 weeks, and I'm proud that you have made it to the finish line. Not everyone does. So for those of you who take on the final and do your best, we're here to root for you, and hopefully everything goes well. Remember that if you have any problems with the proctoring service, the relevant information is on the course website. So let me show the relevant information to you. Now you're seeing me look at it. Share my screen with you for a second. So it's under course information and support. And if you go to student support, technical support, remember, if you need any technical support with proctoring, make sure you're aware of this information. We can't help you with this as a course team. We'd love to, but we just don't have the knowledge to help you with it. So you do two things. You have technical issues, you contact our proctoring partner, Software Secure, at this number, or if you're an international student, at this number. And you also send an email to ASU to notify them that you have this problem, and you describe what the problem is. We are doing our best to accommodate, and if this is something that really prevents you from taking the final, there's other things that we can do. But most importantly, let's get this final out of the way. And before you even start, make sure it all works. And if it doesn't work, contact technical support. That means something else. That means you have a week to do the final. But given that you should first make sure that everything is working and in place, and there's a way to test it as well, you have a little proctoring test exam, make sure that everything works. Do not start the final right before it's due. Make sure that you have a couple of days in case you have a technical glitch and you can't immediately do the final. You need to resolve some of the technical support issues before. We've had several students in the past who didn't do this. I know, I understand procrastination is something that comes naturally to a lot of people, and waiting till the last minute is something that comes naturally to a lot of people. Don't do that here, because if you run into a technical problem, that might mean you won't be able to complete the exam, and that would be unfortunate. So don't let the technical issues get in the way of your knowledge. Well, that completes my kind of interactive part of this course, and I want to say this and want to end with this, which is that I teach this class largely in honor of my dad, who used to be an avid teacher and loved teaching. And here's my dad teaching in a classroom in the Netherlands in the 1960s. Of all the rounds that we've taught of this course, I must say I really want to thank all of you who actively participated in the discussion boards. For those of you who did, you made it extremely lively, and some of the discussions went way beyond the course material with questions about some of the policy topics that I just touched on this office hour. And so for those of you who did, thank you very much. Creating a classroom environment like the one you see here in this picture online takes everyone to participate, and I'm glad you felt comfortable posting questions on the discussion board. I hope our answers have been helpful to you, and as a result, I've really enjoyed this round of this class, and I hope you have too. With that, the only thing I can say is go and do the final and get your final grade. Good luck.